The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn as David Rodriguez stepped out onto his back patio, coffee mug in hand. At 42 years old, he had every reason to feel proud of what he'd built. The sprawling house behind him wasn't just a home. It was proof that the American dream was still alive for those willing to work for it. 15 years ago, David had been sleeping on his cousin's couch in a cramped apartment, surviving on instant noodles and determination. He'd started his tech consulting business with nothing but a borrowed laptop and an unshakable belief that he could help small businesses navigate the digital world. Those early days had been brutal. 18-hour workdays were normal. Weekends didn't exist. Every dollar earned went right back into the business. But slowly, painfully, it had worked. One satisfied client led to another. Word spread through the business community about this young guy who could solve any computer problem and explain it in plain English. By year 5, he had hired his first employee. By year 10, he was running a team of 20 specialists. Now Rodriguez Tech Solutions was the go-to firm for companies across 3 states. The numbers on his latest bank statement still seemed unreal sometimes. $12 million. $12 million. He remembered the exact moment he'd first seen that figure sitting in his accountant's office last month. He'd stared at the screen for a full minute, wondering if there was some mistake. "Daddy, are you coming swimming or what?" His daughter's voice snapped him back to the present. 8-year-old Isabella was already in the pool, her dark hair streaming behind her as she practiced the backstroke her swim coach had been teaching her. At the shallow end, his 6-year-old son Miguel was busy with his collection of floating toys, creating what he called the greatest water battle in history. "Just admiring my kingdom," David called back, grinning as Isabella rolled her eyes in that way only children could master. His wife Maria emerged from the house carrying a tray, loaded with sandwiches and fresh fruit. After 14 years of marriage, she still took his breath away. She'd been with him through everything: the lean years when they could barely afford rent, the stress-filled nights when he worried the business might fail, and now this strange, new reality where money wasn't something they had to think about every single day. "Your kingdom needs some sunscreen, Your Majesty," she said, setting the tray down on the outdoor dining table. "Isabella, come here. You're getting pink." The backyard they were enjoying hadn't happened by accident. David had spent months working with architects and contractors to create exactly what he'd dreamed of during those years in cramped apartments. The infinity pool seemed to blend seamlessly with the valley view beyond. The outdoor kitchen was equipped better than most restaurants. Every detail had been carefully planned and executed. The property sat on just over 2 acres in Willowbrook Heights, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the area. When they'd first looked at houses here 3 years ago, Maria had worried they were reaching too high. The mortgage payments would stretch their budget, even with the business doing well. But David had insisted. His children deserved to grow up somewhere beautiful and safe. They deserved space to run and play. They deserved the best he could give them. "Remember our first apartment?" Maria asked, settling into the chair beside him. She'd been reading his mind again, something she'd gotten scary good at over the years. "You mean the one where the bathroom door didn't close and the neighbors upstairs tap danced at 2 in the morning?" David laughed. "Hard to forget. You used to say you'd buy us a house with a pool someday." "I did, didn't I?" He looked out at his children, now engaged in some elaborate game involving pool noodles and dramatic sound effects. Seemed impossible back then. It hadn't just been about money, though. Moving to Willowbrook Heights had been about more than upgrading their living situation. David wanted his children to grow up somewhere they'd never have to worry about their safety or their future. He wanted them to see successful people who looked like them. He wanted them to believe deep in their bones that they could achieve anything. The neighborhood was everything he'd hoped for. Quiet streets lined with mature oak trees, well-maintained parks, excellent schools. The houses were substantial, but not showy, occupied by doctors, lawyers, business owners, and other professionals. It was the kind of place where children rode their bikes without supervision, and neighbors looked out for each other. Well, theoretically, they looked out for each other. In 3 years of living here, David had to admit he hadn't gotten to know many of his neighbors personally. There had been polite waves when checking the mail, brief conversations about the weather, but nothing deeper. He'd been too busy building his business to invest much time in neighborhood relationships. Maria had joined the local parents group and made a few friends, but David remained focused on work. Still, he felt safe here. His family felt safe here. That was what mattered. "Dad, watch this," Miguel called out, then proceeded to perform what could generously be called a cannonball. Water exploded everywhere, including onto his parents' clothes. "Miguel," Maria laughed, shaking droplets from her hair. "You're supposed to warn people before you do that." "I did warn you," I said. "Watch this." "That's warning us to look, not warning us to run for cover," David explained. But he was smiling. This was exactly the kind of Saturday afternoon he'd dreamed about during all those years of sacrifice and struggle. The afternoon stretched ahead of them perfectly. No urgent business calls to return. He'd learned to set boundaries as the company grew. No deadlines looming over the weekend. Just family time in their own private paradise. Maria had invited her sister and brother-in-law to join them later, along with their 2 kids. David's parents were driving up from the city for dinner. It would be the kind of multi-generational gathering that filled the house with laughter and good food and the comfortable chaos that came with a big family. "I'm thinking we should have more days like this," David said, settling deeper into his chair. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, and the sound of his children's laughter mixed with the gentle filter hum of the pool created a perfect soundtrack. "What, you mean days when you're not checking your phone every 5 minutes?" Maria teased. "I do not check my phone every 5 minutes. You checked it twice while I've been sitting here." David glanced down at his phone, then deliberately placed it face down on the table between them. "There, no more phone. This is family time." "Good, because Isabella has been practicing something special to show you. Haven't you, mija?" Their daughter's face lit up. "Dad, you have to watch. I can do a handstand underwater now. Coach Ramon taught me yesterday." For the next 20 minutes, David found himself transported into his children's world of pool games and underwater tricks. Isabella demonstrated her new handstand skills, while Miguel provided color commentary that would have made a sports announcer proud. Maria captured it all on her phone, building the digital memory bank that they'd look back on years from now. This was success, David realized. Not just the money in the bank or the size of his house or the luxury cars in his garage. This moment, right here, his family healthy and happy, and together in a place they could truly call home. The business achievements had been necessary to get here, but they weren't the end goal. They were just the means. The tech consulting world had given him everything he'd dreamed of, but it had also taught him some hard lessons about what really mattered. He'd seen plenty of successful people who'd accumulated wealth but lost their families in the process. He'd watched competitors burn out from the constant pressure to grow and expand. He'd learned that money without purpose was just numbers on a screen. His purpose was clear: providing for his family and creating opportunities for the next generation. Every late night, every difficult client, every stressful decision had been worth it to reach this point, where Saturday afternoons could be spent like this. "Okay, everyone out for lunch," Maria announced. "Food's getting warm." The family gathered around the outdoor table, still dripping from the pool. Isabella chattered about her swim lessons while Miguel constructed an elaborate story about the epic battle his toy boats had just fought. David found himself really listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk or thinking about work problems. This was the life he'd worked so hard to build. Safe, comfortable, filled with possibility. As he looked around at his family enjoying their lunch in their beautiful backyard, David felt a deep sense of gratitude for how far they'd come. He had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, everything would change, that the peaceful Saturday afternoon he was savoring would be remembered not for its perfection, but for the moment when their sense of security was shattered, that the sanctuary he'd worked 15 years to create would suddenly feel very fragile. Indeed, for now, though, there was just the sun and the laughter, and the feeling that all was right with the world. The first sign that something was wrong came as 3 sharp, aggressive knocks on the front gate. The sound cut through the peaceful afternoon like a blade, causing David to look up from his sandwich with a frown. Living in Willowbrook Heights, unexpected visitors were rare. Most people called ahead or used the intercom system at the gate. "Are you expecting someone?" Maria asked, noticing the confusion on her husband's face. "No, nobody." David wiped his hands on a napkin and stood up. "I'll go see who it is." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. David walked through the house to the front door, then stepped outside to see who was at their gate. What he found made his stomach drop. 3 police officers stood outside his property, their patrol cars parked on the street behind them. All 3 were white men, probably in their 30s or 40s. The one in front, apparently their leader, had his hand resting casually on his belt. The other 2 flanked him, their postures suggesting they were ready for some kind of confrontation. David's mind raced as he approached the gate. Had something happened in the neighborhood? Was there some kind of emergency? But as he got closer, he could see from their body language that their focus was entirely on him and his property. "Good afternoon, officers," David said, trying to keep his voice steady and polite. "Is there something I can help you with?" The lead officer looked him up and down with unconcealed suspicion. "We've received reports of suspicious activity at this address. Mind telling us what's going on here?" "Suspicious activity?" David repeated, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. This is my home. My family and I are just having a pool party." "Your home?" The officer's tone suggested he found this hard to believe. "You live here?" "Yes, I live here. We've lived here for 3 years." David felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd experienced this kind of doubt before, the assumption that someone who looked like him couldn't possibly belong in a place like this. "We're going to need to see some identification," the second officer chimed in. David nodded and pulled out his wallet, extracting his driver's license. He handed it through the gate, watching as the lead officer examined it carefully, comparing the address to the house numbers visible on his mailbox. "David Rodriguez," the officer read aloud as if testing the name. "Says here you live at this address. That's correct? How long have you lived here?" 3 years, like I said." The third officer, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "Mind if we ask how you can afford a place like this?" The question hit David like a physical blow. In all his years of building his business, achieving success, and earning his place in this community, he'd never been asked to justify his right to exist in his own home. "I own a tech consulting business," David answered, working hard to keep the anger out of his voice. "I've been in business for 15 years. "Tech consulting," the lead officer repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "That must be pretty profitable work." "It's been good to me, yes?" Behind the officers, David noticed a small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather on the sidewalk across the street. He recognized a few faces, people he'd waved to over the years but never really gotten to know. They stood in small groups, whispering among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. "Sir, we're going to need you to step out here and talk to us properly," the second officer said. "This conversation would be better conducted face to face." David hesitated. Every instinct told him to call his lawyer before this went any further, but he also didn't want to appear uncooperative. These were police officers, after all. He was supposed to be able to trust them. "Of course," he said, punching in the code, to unlock his gate. As soon as he stepped outside his property, the dynamic shifted. The officers spread out slightly, positioning themselves so that David was essentially surrounded. The lead officer handed back his license but continued to study him with suspicious eyes. "So tell us about these reports we received," the first officer said. "Neighbors called in about people who don't belong in this neighborhood, said there was trespassing going on." "Trespassing?" David's voice rose slightly. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my property. My wife and children are in the backyard. We're not trespassing anywhere." "That's what you say," the third officer said. "But we've got multiple reports of suspicious individuals at this address." "What exactly did these reports say?" David asked. "What suspicious activity?" The officers exchanged glances. That's not really your concern, the lead officer replied. Our concern is making sure everything here is legitimate. From inside the house, David could hear Maria calling his name. Through the front windows, he could see Isabella and Miguel peeking out, their faces pressed against the glass with worried expressions. His children were watching their father being interrogated by police on their own property. Officers, I've shown you my identification. You can see that I live here. My family is inside. I'm not sure what else you need from me. Well, for starters, the second officer said, we're going to need to verify that this identification is legitimate. Anyone can get a fake ID these days. A fake ID? David stared at them in disbelief. You think I have a fake driver's license? We've seen stranger things, the lead officer said with a shrug. Guy like you, living in a place like this, it raises questions. The words hung in the air between them. A guy like you. David felt 15 years of hard work, sacrifice, and achievement crumble in the face of those 4 simple words. All his success, all his accomplishments, all his efforts to build a better life for his family. None of it mattered. All these officers saw was a guy like him who didn't belong. What kind of questions? David asked quietly. Questions about how you really afford all this, the third officer said, gesturing toward the house. This neighborhood, this property. It's worth what, 2 million, 3 million? That's a lot of money for someone in your line of work. I've been very successful, David replied through gritted teeth. I've worked hard for everything I have. I'm sure you have, the lead officer said in a tone that suggested he was sure of no such thing. But we're going to need more than your word for it. We're going to need to verify your story. Verify my story? David repeated. What story? I live here. This is my house. What exactly are you trying to verify? For starters, we'd like to take a look around, the second officer said. Make sure everything's on the up and up. Look around. You want to search my house? Just a quick look, the lead officer said. Nothing invasive. We just want to make sure there's no illegal activity going on here. David felt the situation spiraling out of control. Officers, I haven't committed any crime. You have no warrant. I don't consent to any search of my property. The officer's expressions hardened. Sir, your lack of cooperation is noted, the lead officer said coldly. That kind of attitude makes us wonder what you might be hiding. I'm not hiding anything. I'm exercising my legal rights as a property owner and American citizen. Legal rights, the third officer scoffed. Everyone's got legal rights until they start breaking the law. From behind the house, David could hear his children's voices, carrying across the yard. They were still playing, still laughing, unaware that their perfect Saturday was being destroyed by 3 men who had decided that their father was guilty of the crime of existing where he didn't belong. Maria appeared at the front door, still wearing her swimsuit with a towel wrapped around her waist. David, is everything okay? The kids are asking what's happening. Ma'am, please stay inside, the lead officer ordered without taking his eyes off David. This doesn't concern you. This absolutely concerns me, Maria replied firmly. This is my husband and my home. Maria, it's okay, David said, though it clearly wasn't. These officers are just following up on some reports. Reports about what? The officers ignored her question. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us to verify your identity and resolve this situation, the second officer announced. Come. With you where? Down to the station. We need to run your information through the system, make sure everything checks out. David felt a chill run down his spine. Am I under arrest? Not yet, the lead officer said ominously, but that could change depending on how cooperative you choose to be. The crowd of neighbors across the street had grown larger. David could see phones being pulled out, people starting to record or take pictures. Within hours, videos of this confrontation would probably be circulating on social media. His children's friends would see them. His business clients would see them. Everyone would see David Rodriguez, successful businessman and devoted father, being treated like a criminal in front of his own home. Officers, David said, struggling to keep his voice level. I've been polite and cooperative. I've shown you my identification, and answered your questions. But I'm not going anywhere with you, and you're not searching my property without a warrant. If you have specific charges to bring against me, then bring them. Otherwise, I'd like you to leave my family alone." The three officers looked at each other again, clearly frustrated by David's refusal to be intimidated. The lead officer stepped closer, close enough that David could smell coffee on his breath. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, pronouncing the name with exaggerated care, "I don't think you understand the situation you're in here. We've got multiple." The situation took a dramatic turn for the worse when two more patrol cars pulled up to the curb. David watched in growing disbelief as 4 additional officers emerged from their vehicles, bringing the total to 7 law enforcement personnel, now gathered outside his home. The neighborhood street, which had been quiet and peaceful just an hour ago, now looked like the scene of a major criminal investigation. "Backup's here," the lead officer said into his radio, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made David's blood run cold. "Situation is under control, but we may need additional support." Additional support for what? David wondered. For a family pool party? For a man standing on his own property with valid identification? The absurdity of it all would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. The new officers immediately spread out, creating what any reasonable person would recognize as a containment formation. 2 positioned themselves near David's gate, effectively blocking his path back to his own property. 2 more took up positions on either side of the street, cutting off any potential escape routes. The remaining officers flanked David himself, making it clear that he was now essentially surrounded. "Sir, I'm Officer Thompson," one of the newly arrived officers announced. He was older than the others, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone used to being in charge. "I understand we have a situation here that needs to be resolved." "There's no situation," David replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'm standing on my own property. I've shown these officers my identification. I've answered their questions. There's no crime being committed here." Officer Thompson looked at the original 3 officers. "What's the nature of the complaint?" "Multiple reports of suspicious individuals at this address," the lead officer responded. "Possible trespassing. Subject has been uncooperative and evasive." Uncooperative. David couldn't keep the indignation out of his voice anymore. "I've been completely cooperative. I showed you my license. I answered your questions. How exactly have I been uncooperative?" "Your attitude, for starters," the second officer replied. "Legitimate residents don't usually get defensive when police ask reasonable questions." "Reasonable questions like how I can afford my own house?" The officers exchanged glances. Thompson stepped closer to David, close enough that David had to resist the urge to step backward. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down. Getting agitated isn't helping anyone here." "I'm not agitated, I'm concerned. 7 police officers have now shown up at my home, based on what you claim are reports of suspicious activity, but nobody will tell me what this suspicious activity supposedly was." "That's classified information related to an ongoing investigation," Thompson replied smoothly. "An investigation into what? What crime do you think has been committed?" "That remains to be determined." From inside the house, David could see Maria moving around frantically. She'd clearly noticed the arrival of additional police cars and was probably trying to figure out what to do. Through the windows, he could also see his children's faces. Isabella and Miguel pressed against the glass, their expressions shifting from curiosity to real fear as they watched more and more officers surrounding their father. This was exactly what David had worked so hard to avoid. He'd bought this house, moved to this neighborhood, built his success specifically so his children would never have to see their father treated this way. He'd wanted them to grow up feeling safe and secure, believing they belonged wherever they chose to be. Now they were watching him being surrounded by police on their own front lawn. "Officers," David said, making one more attempt at reasoned communication. "My children are watching this. They're scared. Whatever you think is happening here, surely we can resolve it without traumatizing 2 young kids." "Should have thought about that before you decided to be uncooperative," one of the newer officers said coldly. Thompson held up a hand. "Let's everybody take a step back here. Mr. He looked at the license, still in the original officer's hand. "Mr. Rodriguez, here's what's going to happen. We're going to need additional verification of your identity and your legal right to be on this property." "Additional verification? I've shown you my driver's license with this address on it." "Driver's licenses can be forged," Thompson replied. "We're going to need something more substantial." "Like what?" "Property deed would be good. Mortgage documents. Something that proves you actually own this place and didn't just get a fake ID made with this address on it." David stared at him. "You want me to produce my property deed? Right now? On the street?" "That would certainly help clear this up quickly." "And if I don't have immediate access to those documents? What then?" "Then we'll have to resolve this situation another way." The threat was clear, even if it wasn't stated explicitly. David felt his options narrowing with each passing minute. The crowd of neighbors across the street had grown to nearly 20 people, many of them holding phones to record the confrontation. Some of his neighbors were people he'd waved to for 3 years. Others were complete strangers who'd been drawn by the commotion. Not one of them had stepped forward to vouch for him. Not one had told the officers that yes, this man lived here, that they'd seen him coming and going for years, that his children played in the yard and his wife tended the garden. They just stood and watched and recorded as if this was entertainment. "I need to go inside and get those documents," David said finally. "No, sir," Thompson replied immediately. "You're not going anywhere unsupervised. If you need to retrieve documents, one of my officers will accompany you. You want to escort me into my own house? For everyone's safety, yes." David felt a surge of anger so intense it made him dizzy. For everyone's safety. As if he were the dangerous one in this situation. As if he were the threat that needed to be contained and monitored. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Let's get this over with." But as he started toward his gate, Thompson held up a hand again. "Actually, on second thought, I think it would be better if you had someone else retrieve those documents for you. Keep things simple." "Someone else?" "Your wife, maybe. She can bring out whatever paperwork you need." David realized what was happening. They didn't want him going back into his house because once he was inside, he might be able to call his lawyer, or lock the door, or otherwise complicate their investigation. They wanted him to remain outside, exposed and vulnerable, while they maintained complete control of the situation. "Maria," David called toward the house. His wife appeared at the front door almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for him to call. "Can you bring me the property deed and mortgage papers? They're in the filing cabinet in the home office." Maria nodded and disappeared back inside. David could see her moving quickly through the house, probably as anxious as he was to resolve this nightmare and get these officers away from their family. While they waited, the officers continued their intimidation tactics. They walked around the perimeter of David's property, peering over fences and through gaps in the hedge that surrounded his yard. They examined his cars parked in the driveway, walking around them and looking through the windows. They treated his home like a crime scene and him like a suspect. "Nice cars," one of the officers commented, stopping next to David's Mercedes sedan. "What did this run you, about $70,000? "Something like that." $70,000, the officer repeated as if the amount were inherently suspicious. "That's more than a lot of people make in a year. I've been fortunate in my business." "Must be some business," another officer chimed in. "Tech consulting, was it?" "That's right." "What kind of tech consulting exactly?" David was tired of being interrogated, but he answered anyway. "I help businesses integrate new software systems, upgrade their IT infrastructure, train their employees on new technologies. I've got contracts with companies all over the region." "Contracts," Thompson repeated thoughtfully. "See, that's interesting, because in my experience, contractors don't usually make the kind of money that buys houses like this." "Well, I've been very successful." "So you keep saying." Maria reappeared with a manila folder full of documents. She walked to the gate, but hesitated when she saw how many officers were now present. "David? What's going on? Why are there so many police here?" "Just bring me the papers, honey. Everything's fine." But everything clearly wasn't fine, and they all knew it. Maria handed the folder through the gate, her hand shaking slightly. David could see the fear in her eyes, and it broke his heart. She'd grown up in a middle-class family, gone to college, built a career as a teacher. She'd never experienced anything like this. Thompson took the folder and began examining the documents with the deliberate slowness of someone determined to find a problem. He studied the property deed, compared signatures, checked dates. The other officers waited in silence as if this were a perfectly normal way to spend a Saturday afternoon. These documents appear to be in order, Thompson finally admitted, his tone suggesting he was disappointed by this fact. Of course they're in order, David replied. I've been telling you the truth from the beginning. Well, documents can be forged too, one of the other officers said. We'd need to verify these with the county records office. On a Saturday afternoon, we have ways of checking these things. As the confrontation stretched into its second hour, David realized that traditional cooperation and reasoned argument weren't going to resolve this situation. The officers had clearly made up their minds about him, and no amount of documentation or explanation was going to change their perception. He needed to try a different approach. Standing there surrounded by 7 police officers on his own property, David remembered a conversation he'd had just 2 months earlier at the annual Willowbrook Heights Community Foundation Gala. He'd been there as one of the event's major sponsors. Rodriguez Tech Solutions had donated $50,000 to support local youth programs. During the cocktail reception, he'd found himself in conversation with Police Chief Patricia Gonzalez, a sharp woman in her late 40s who'd been brought in from a larger city to modernize the department. They'd talked for nearly 30 minutes about community policing initiatives, about the challenges of building trust between law enforcement and diverse communities, about the importance of having police officers who understood and reflected the populations they served. Chief Gonzalez had impressed David with her thoughtful approach to these issues and her genuine commitment to reform. More importantly, she'd given him her business card and told him to call directly if he ever had concerns about police services in the community. I believe in accountability, she'd said. If my officers aren't serving all citizens with equal respect and professionalism, I need to know about it. David pulled out his phone, grateful that he'd saved her number under Chief Gonzalez in his contacts. Sir, I'm going to need you to put that phone away, Officer Thompson said immediately, stepping closer. I'm calling Police Chief Gonzalez, David replied calmly. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here, and I'd like her to help resolve it. You don't need to call anyone, the lead officer from the original group interjected. We're handling this situation appropriately. Are you? David asked, his finger hovering over the call button. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like 7 police officers have spent 2 hours harassing a law-abiding citizen and his family based on anonymous complaints that none of you will specify. Sir, put the phone down, Thompson ordered, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. I have the right to make a phone call. Not while you're part of an active investigation. Investigation into what? What crime do you think I've committed? The officers exchanged uncertain glances. David could see that his mention of calling the chief directly had shifted something in the dynamic. They were still trying to maintain control, but there was a new wariness in their expressions. I'm calling her, David announced, and pressed the button before anyone could stop him. The phone rang twice before Chief Gonzalez answered. This is Chief Gonzalez. Chief, this is David Rodriguez from Rodriguez Tech Solutions. We met at the Community Foundation Gala a couple months ago. Yes, Mr. Rodriguez, I remember. What can I do for you? David took a deep breath. Chief, I'm standing in front of my house right now with 7 of your officers surrounding me. They've been here for over 2 hours questioning my right to live in my own home, demanding additional proof that I own my property, and treating my family like criminals. I need your help. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Chief Gonzalez spoke again, her voice had hardened considerably. 7 officers at your residence? What's the nature of the complaint? They say they received reports of suspicious activity, but they won't tell me what the activity was or who reported it. I've shown them my identification, provided property, documents, answered all their questions, but they keep escalating the situation. What officers are present? Let me speak to the ranking officer. David looked at Thompson. The chief wants to speak to whoever's in charge. Thompson's face had gone pale. He reached for David's phone with obvious reluctance. "This is Officer Thompson." David couldn't hear Chief Gonzalez's side of the conversation, but he could see its effect on Thompson's expression. The older officer's confidence evaporated as he listened, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. "Yes, ma'am," Thompson said. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. Right away, ma'am." The call lasted less than 3 minutes, but David could see that those 3 minutes had completely transformed the situation. When Thompson handed the phone back, his entire demeanor had changed. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said formally, "there appears to have been a significant misunderstanding here. Chief Gonzalez has instructed us to conclude this interaction immediately." "A misunderstanding?" David repeated. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Thompson looked uncomfortable. "The chief will be conducting a full review of today's incident. In the meantime, we'll be clearing the scene." Just like that, the officers began to disperse. The ones who had been standing around David's property walked back toward their cars. The ones examining his vehicles stepped away. The commanding presence that had surrounded him for 2 hours simply evaporated. But David wasn't ready to let them leave quite so easily. "Officer Thompson, I'd like to know what reports you received that brought you here in the first place." Thompson hesitated, clearly caught between his desire to leave and his obligation to answer questions. The complaint was vague. Someone reported seeing people at this address who they felt didn't belong in the neighborhood. People who didn't belong? What did that mean exactly? The caller didn't specify. "And based on that vague report, you felt justified in surrounding my home with 7 officers and interrogating my family for 2 hours. Thompson's jaw tightened. "We were following standard procedures for investigating suspicious activity reports." "Standard procedures," David repeated. "Tell me, Officer Thompson, do you respond to every vague report of people who don't belong with 7 officers in a 2-hour investigation?" The officer didn't answer, which was answer enough. As the patrol cars began to pull away from David's street, he could see his neighbors across the street starting to disperse as well. The show was over. They tucked their phones away and wandered back to their own homes, leaving David to process what had just happened. Maria came running out of the house as soon as the last police car disappeared around the corner. "David, what was that about? What did Chief Gonzalez say?" "She's going to investigate," David replied, though he was still trying to process the rapid change in the officer's behavior. One phone call had accomplished what 2 hours of cooperation and documentation couldn't. The power of that connection, of having the chief's direct number and her immediate support, had cut through the intimidation and hostility like a blade. Isabella and Miguel emerged from the house more cautiously, staying close to their mother. "Daddy, why were all those police cars here?" Isabella asked. "Did something bad happen?" David knelt down to his daughter's level, struggling to find words that would make sense to an 8-year-old. "Sometimes there are misunderstandings, mija. The police thought something was wrong, but it wasn't. Everything's okay now." "Are they going to come back?" "No, sweetheart. They're not coming back." But even as David reassured his children, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was really okay. Yes, the immediate crisis had passed. Yes, Chief Gonzalez's intervention had ended the harassment, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Chief Gonzalez's number. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want to personally apologize for what happened today," she said as soon as he answered. "What you described is completely unacceptable, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." "I appreciate that, Chief, but I have to ask, if I hadn't had your direct number, if I hadn't been able to call you, what would have happened? Would those officers still be here?" There was a long pause before she answered. "I'd like to think my officers would have resolved the situation appropriately regardless of my intervention. But you don't know for sure." "No," she admitted quietly, "I don't know for sure." "That's what I thought. Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that I'll be conducting a full investigation into today's incident. I'll be reviewing the original complaint, examining the officer's response, and determining whether appropriate procedures were followed." What happens if you find that procedures weren't followed? There will be consequences. I can't go into specifics, but I want you to know that this kind of behavior doesn't reflect the standards I expect from my department. David appreciated her words, but he also understood the reality of the situation. He'd been protected not by the system working as it should, but by his personal connection to someone in power. His wealth and community standing had given him access to the chief's phone number. That access had saved him from whatever the officers had been planning to do next. But what about the people who didn't have Chief Gonzalez's phone number? What about the families who couldn't afford to live in Willowbrook Heights, who didn't donate $50,000 to community foundations, who didn't rub shoulders with police chiefs at charity galas? "Chief, I have one more question," David said. "The officers kept talking about reports of suspicious activity. Do you know what those reports actually said?" "I'm still looking into that, but based on my initial review, it appears the complaint was extremely vague. Someone called to report seeing people. 48 hours after the incident, David received the phone call he'd been waiting for. Chief Gonzalez's voice was professional, but carried an undertone of genuine regret as she delivered her findings. "Mr. Rodriguez, I've completed my initial investigation into Saturday's incident at your residence," she began. "I want to start by offering you and your family a formal apology on behalf of the Willowbrook Heights Police Department. What happened to you was completely unacceptable and violated several of our departmental policies." David was sitting in his home office, the same room where just 2 days earlier his wife had frantically searched for property documents to prove their right to live in their own house. "I appreciate the apology, Chief. What did your investigation find?" The original complaint that prompted the police response was made by an anonymous caller who reported seeing suspicious individuals at your address. When pressed by our dispatcher for specifics, the caller could provide no details about any actual criminal activity. They simply stated that they saw people at your house who didn't look like they belonged in the neighborhood. The words hit David like a physical blow, even though he'd suspected as much. Someone had looked at his family enjoying their pool party and decided they were criminals based on nothing more than their appearance. Based on that vague complaint, Chief Gonzalez continued, the responding officers should have conducted a brief welfare check and closed the incident when they confirmed there was no criminal activity. Instead, they escalated the situation far beyond what was warranted. What consequences will they face? Officer Thompson, who was the ranking officer on scene, is being suspended without pay for 2 weeks and will undergo mandatory retraining on proper complaint investigation procedures and community relations. The other officers involved will receive written reprimands and additional training. Additionally, I'm implementing new protocols that require supervisor approval before more than 2 officers can respond to vague, suspicious activity calls. It was more than David had expected, but it still felt insufficient given what his family had endured. "Chief, I have to ask, do you think this would have happened if I were white?" There was a long pause before she answered. "Mr. Rodriguez, I can't speak to the motivations of every individual officer, but I will say this. Our department has work to do in ensuring all citizens receive equal treatment regardless of their race or ethnicity. This incident has made that very clear to me." After ending the call with Chief Gonzalez, David sat in his office for a long time, staring out the window at the neighborhood he'd once felt so proud to call home. The formal apology and disciplinary actions were a start, but they didn't address the larger problem. Somewhere in Willowbrook Heights there was still a person who had looked at his family and seen criminals. That person was still his neighbor. That mindset was still part of his community. Over the next few weeks, David found himself thinking constantly about what he wanted to do with this experience. He could let it go, accept the apology and disciplinary actions, and try to move on with his life. Many people in his position would do exactly that, but every time he closed his eyes, he could see his children's frightened faces pressed against the window, watching their father surrounded by police officers on their own property. The turning point came during a city council meeting 3 weeks after the incident. David had decided to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because he felt he needed to be more engaged with local government. He sat in the back of the meeting room, listening to discussions about budget allocations and zoning variances when Mayor Jennifer Walsh called for public comments. Is there anyone present who would like to address the council tonight? David found himself standing before he'd consciously decided to speak. Yes, I'd like to say something. As he walked to the podium, David saw Chief Gonzalez sitting in the front row with other department heads. She nodded at him, a gesture that seemed to contain both encouragement and apprehension about what he might say. Good evening. My name is David Rodriguez, and I live in the Willowbrook Heights neighborhood. 3 weeks ago, 7 police officers surrounded my home and interrogated my family for over 2 hours, based on an anonymous complaint that we looked suspicious in our own neighborhood. A murmur went through the small audience. David could see council members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I want to be clear that Chief Gonzalez has handled this matter professionally and appropriately. The officers involved have faced consequences and new protocols have been implemented to prevent similar incidents. But that's not why I'm here tonight. David looked out at the faces in the audience, a mix of city employees, local business owners, and engaged citizens. Most were white, middle-aged, and looked exactly like the kind of people who belonged in places like city council meetings. I'm here because I've realized that my experience, while traumatic for my family, was actually the best-case scenario. I had resources and connections that allowed me to resolve the situation quickly. I had Chief Gonzalez's phone number. I had documentation readily available. I had the confidence that comes from success and financial security. But what happens to families who don't have those advantages? The room had grown completely quiet. David could see that his words were making people uncomfortable, which was exactly what he intended. What happens to the single mother working 2 jobs who can't afford to live in Willowbrook Heights but gets pulled over here while visiting a friend? What happens to the teenager walking through our neighborhood who doesn't have a business owner's confidence when talking to police? What happens to the elderly man whose English isn't perfect and who can't call the chief directly when officers question his right to be somewhere? Council member Robert Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Rodriguez, are you suggesting our police department has systemic problems? I'm suggesting that my ability to make one phone call shouldn't be the difference between being treated with dignity and being harassed. I'm suggesting that we have work to do as a community. What would you propose? David had spent weeks thinking about this exact question. I propose we create a civilian oversight committee for police interactions, with particular focus on bias, training, and community relations. I propose we implement body cameras for all officers, with footage available for public review in cases of complaints. And I propose we fund community programs that bring together police officers and residents in non-enforcement settings, so officers see community members as people rather than potential suspects. Those are expensive proposals, Mayor Walsh pointed out. They're less expensive than lawsuits. They're less expensive than lost trust in law enforcement. And they're less expensive than having families feel unsafe in their own community. David paused, looking directly at each council member. My company, Rodriguez Tech Solutions, will fund the initial implementation of these programs. Consider it an investment in the community we all share. The offer created a buzz of whispered conversations throughout the room. David had expected this reaction. Money talked in municipal politics, and his willingness to put significant funding behind his proposals would make them much harder to ignore. After the meeting, Chief Gonzalez approached him in the parking lot. That was well done, she said, and your funding offer will make a real difference. I hope so. But Chief, I need you to know that this isn't about criticizing you or your department. This is about making sure the system works for everyone, not just people who happen to have your phone number. I understand, and I support what you're trying to do. Change is never easy, especially in law enforcement, but it's necessary. Over the following months, David threw himself into community activism with the same intensity he'd once reserved for building his business. He attended every city council meeting, joined the police reform committee that grew out of his initial proposal, and used his business connections to fund bias training programs for the entire police department. The work was harder than he'd anticipated. There was resistance from some officers who felt they were being unfairly criticized, There were community members who thought he was being too aggressive and pushing for change. There were bureaucratic obstacles and budget constraints and the slow pace of institutional reform. But there were also victories. Body cameras were implemented for all patrol officers. The Civilian Oversight Committee was established with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend changes. Community policing programs brought officers into schools and neighborhood centers for positive interactions with residents. Most importantly, David began to see changes in how his own family was perceived in the community. Neighbors who had once been strangers started stopping by to introduce themselves. His children began receiving playdates invitations from classmates whose parents had previously kept their distance. The invisible barriers that had separated him from full acceptance in Willowbrook Heights began to crumble. One evening, 6 months after the incident, David was working in his front yard when his neighbor from across the street approached him. Tom Bradley was a retired accountant who'd lived in the neighborhood for 15 years. They'd waved to each other countless times, but had never had a real conversation.